The origin of this paper goes back to my Wesley Historical Society lecture on John Wesley's original itinerant preachers, male, given in Bradford in 2000. At the end of that paper, there was a question from Margaret Jones, who I wish was with us here today, about women preachers. I didn't really answer the question, but I undertook to look at the whole question later, and this paper represents some kind of fulfillment of that promise. And acknowledgements are due to many friends, some present today, who have assisted in a number of different ways. Definitions. Calling can be interpreted in two ways. The actual process by which women became preachers, their invitation from God to preach, and why they thought it came to them, and then what they actually did as preachers, the result of the original call. I hope to cover both, those spending more time on the second, the actual labouring for their Lord. This last was a phrase used by the women about what they did, especially in the journals and in their letters to each other, and we've had it already this morning. Early includes some of the first half of the 19th century, as well as the 18th century preachers. Looking back now, today, from the early 20th century, the period up to 1820 is still, in quotes, early. I'm only dealing with Wesleyans, not primitive Methodists or Bible Christians. 1760 is chosen because those English women who were Methodist leaders before 1760, such as Grace Murray or Sarah Perrin, seem only to have exhorted rather than preached, in contrast to their later sisters. So we got a period of 60 years, half of which was in John Wesley's lifetime and half after his death. I should say about John Wesley, this phrase, the extraordinary call, comes, of course, from John Wesley. He used it in 3 different contexts, and the contexts are interesting. The first one was in relation to himself, early on, 1738-39, a letter to Charles, where he describes his call as an extraordinary call, in contrast to the ordinary call of the ordinary clergyman, because he was being called to other people's parishes. The world is my parish is another way of expressing it. The second usage by John Wesley is in regard to the lay itinerant preachers. And again, you got the contrast with the ordinary clergy. And the third example is later, 1761, in the correspondence with Mary Bosanquet. And here it's being used of the call to women preachers. And it's still the contrast with the ordinary clergy. So you've got those 3 interesting examples of John Wesley's use of the phrase there. 1820 has been chosen as the end date because by then both primitive Methodists and Bible Christians were beginning to spread from their original heartlands, so that nationally women preachers could choose a different Methodist home. For many women preachers, we know little more than the name and where they lived. So the numbers mentioned here are much fewer than those who actually preached. For this research, I've developed a database of some 66 women preachers of the period who are Wesleyans. They include 35 of those who you'll find in Appendix A of Paul Chilcott's book of 1991. Early Methodism has long been seen as a good example of Thirst's law at work. Women were able to achieve a temporary position of influence in the early stages of the evangelical revival, which was not sustained into the 19th century, when male ministers imposed a measure of control. I would argue that the temporary influence was still there in 1820 and later, certainly in marginal areas, particularly rural society where women were always important in Methodism. This argument about the permanence of the enlargement of the spheres of female influence can be found in many works. Hempton, Mack, D.R. Wilson all discuss this. In Wilson's case, with particular regard to Mary Fletcher, slide here. Mack suggested a concept of, quote, agency in which autonomy is less important than self-transcendence, and in which the energy to act in the world is generated and sustained by a prior act of personal surrender, which brings us to consider how the early women preachers were called. Their call should be seen in two stages. First, conversion, and second, the call to preach. As usual, in general, we know little, have to reason from the few for whom we can find some evidence. Of those 66 women preachers, we only know about the conversions of 28 and the calls of 18. Conversions are not always dated. We do not always know whose preaching led to the conversion. 4 of the preachers, in fact, are unknown. 21 of the women preachers named the preacher by whom they were converted. Of these 21 named preachers who were successful in gaining conversion, Mary Barrett here appears 4 times, significantly more than anybody else. John Wesley and George Whitefield, twice each. Nobody else more than once. In the list are preachers such as Thomas Maxfield, Joseph Benson, John Berridge, William Bramwell, who we heard about this morning and we'll come back to, and Samuel Bardsley. The dates of the conversions range from the beginnings of Methodism in the early 1740s to as late as 1813. The call to preach is less well documented than the conversion, just as with the male itinerant preacher. Of the 18 of whom we know something, many were responding to the absence of a male preacher, not necessarily an itinerant. Alice Cross, at her house in Booth Bank in North Cheshire, fixed the pulpit in their largest room. She was the leader of the society there. If the preacher failed to arrive, she occupied that pulpit in his place. Similarly, in Cornwall, Anne Gilbert began preaching in 1771, quote, when the preacher happened not to come, unquote. She went on to preach widely by general invitation, unlike Alice Cross, who never preached outside Booth Bank. Another in Cornwall who responded when no preacher came, and from that developed her call, was Mrs. Elizabeth Collett at Gwynier. She was in Anne Gilbert's class, so had Anne Gilbert as a model. Then she moved to another village. She persuaded her employer to have preaching in his house. One day, the preacher did not come. The congregation, having waited some considerable time, called her to speak to them. She gave out a hymn and prayed, but they still insisted that she spoke. So she began speaking to them, and the power of God came down among them. They made her preach again, and she was then invited to many other places. Sarah Crosby at Derby in early 1761 found herself faced with a class which swelled in a single week from 20 to 200. She preached to them. Wesley encouraged her while trying to stretch his itinerants a little further in order to help her. Several of them were challenged by other preachers, both men and women. William Bramwell, the famous revivalist, was well known for his question, quote, why do not more women preach, unquote. It was that challenge which led to Elizabeth Tomlinson, later Evans, the original for Dinah Morris in George Eliot's Adam Bede, responding to the call to preach. Bramwell, the inscription on her tombstone here, you can see is slightly longer than her husband's. Bramwell, from 1793, encouraged Anne Cutler to come to his circuits to help him in revival. Some biblical texts struck home. Charlotte Berger was particularly affected by the text, quote, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good tidings to the meek," unquote. Sarah Cox felt her mind continually applied by, quote, "Cry aloud, spare not, lift up thy voice like a trumpet," unquote. At least 2 women went to Madeley to hear Mrs. Fletcher and came away from Madeley preachers. Mary Fletcher had encouraged them to speak in the tithe barn there, and having heard her call, they took it to other places. This is how Diana Thomas of Kington and Susanna Knapp of Stourport became preachers. Mary Fletcher had already encouraged first Sally Lawrence and then Mary Tooth, and turned each of them into preachers as they lived in her family. Mary Barrett stayed with Mary Wiltshaw in 1799. Mary Wiltshaw became a preacher as a result. Mary Barrett herself recounts her own call as linked to her conversion. Quote, "I felt much concern for the happiness of my neighbours and took every opportunity of talking to and praying with and for them," unquote. Later, she found the challenge from Ann Cutler in 1792 reinforced that original call, but when Ann Cutler asked Mary Barrett in Mary Barrett's home, "if I thought I had any business at home." Incidentally, this portrait of Mary Barrett, which is a bit faded, sorry, it's better on my screen than yours, at least from here, lives here in Westminster and is on display in the exhibition in the Glasgow room, so when you go back there, look at it. Charlotte Berger was challenged by the Anglican evangelical Thomas Scott in London in 1815. Diana Thomas encouraged Mary Tooth to continue preaching after Mary Fletcher's death. Sometimes the call was from another woman preacher who asked them to travel with them. Mary Tooth and Sally Lawrence started by going with Mrs. Fletcher. Mary Barrett had the younger Mary Tatum with her in the Nottingham circuit. Charlotte Berger was called to assist the older Henrietta Webster. Dreams, visions, fits, and trances. Sometimes the call came in ways which we might wonder about. Some women preachers were particularly affected by dreams. Charlotte Berger, at the time she was about to start preaching, had a dream, quote, "that there was a vast work appointed for her to do. It seemed there was a vast iron machine which I was required to lift up. Attempting to do this, I found there were enemies opposing me, who had so altered the form of the machine as to cause me the greatest possible perplexity. Awaking and pondering over my dream, the second verse of Isaiah 45 came to my mind. Quote, I will go before thee and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass and cut asunder the bars of iron. Sorry. Two women, at least in their early days, suffered from fits which seemed linked to preaching in that they were preaching while in a fit or a trance. This was true of Elizabeth Dickinson of Staveley near Knaresborough, who had visions where she was commanded to preach, and in preaching frequently referred to her visions. More famously, and with the clearest description of what happened, was the much more long-lived preacher, Sarah Mallet, later Boyce, in Norfolk. Sarah, who always suffered from much physical illness, at the age of 23 began to have fits, during which she first told others to turn to God, and soon began preaching from texts. For a month this continued to happen, with more and more people coming to hear her. A few days after her final fit, her uncle asked her to preach in his chapel at Long Stratton. Soon she attracted Wesley's attention, eventually received from him Conference's permission to preach. It's been suggested by her modern biographer, who consulted various medical experts, that seizures could be a form of epilepsy, but could also be a depressive illness, perhaps caused by an inadequate diet. For those of you disturbed by any of that, her modern biographer reports she continued to preach for another 55 years after that. What was their calling? What did they do? There were at least three main types of women preachers and preaching. The first category may be described as single-place preachers. Alice Cross is a good example, but there were many others. Often they were particularly in areas which had no Methodist preaching previously. Women preachers settled in an area where Methodism might not be known, or at least had little earlier success, began to preach in their own house, and maintained a witness, often for a considerable time. Other examples include Elizabeth Baker, later Jordan at Monmouth, Susanna Knapp in Stourport, Margaret Watson, Redcar, Sarah Lawrence, Coalport, Jean Bisson and Madame Perrott in Jersey, and Elizabeth Clarkson at Craig Hall in the North Riding. Many other women preachers began in this way, but proved so popular that they went on to preach much more widely. Examples of this are Sarah Crosby, Mary Bosanquet, Mrs. Boyce and Mrs. Grigson, Mrs. Webster and Miss Berger in Saffron Walden in the 19th century. Mrs. Collett twice moved to new parts of Cornwall. In each case, she started a class, invited the preachers to her house, made a room available for them, preached herself if for some reason no preacher turned up. All these were very different from the male itinerant who was tied to a 6-week rotation around a circuit. The second category were women preachers who were well-known evangelists, to use a later term, who preached over wide areas, going from society to society like the men, but not necessarily or even usually following the circuit plan. They might well stay in one place for several weeks. Examples of this include Mary Bosanquet in the 1770s in Yorkshire, Elizabeth Hurrell, Sarah Crosby, Mary Barrett, Sarah Mallet and Anne Cutler. Like the itinerants, they stayed in Methodist houses and were fed by Methodists. Unlike them, they had no conference, though they might well, as Mary Barrett did, attend services and meetings associated with the male conference each year. They would stay longer in places which responded. They might return again and again in future years. Sarah Crosby in 1777 reported that up until the 4th of December, she had, quote, ridden 960 miles, kept 220 public meetings, and around 600 private meetings. We had this distinction this morning. Public meetings, she meant services, as opposed to the private meetings of Methodist classes and bands. By the 1790s, we find in the correspondence of Mary Barrett that this kind of evangelism was being organized by some circuit superintendents, sometimes under pressure from lay leaders, more usually because they'd heard of the women's success. They would invite evangelists like Mary Barrett or Anne Cutler to come to their circuits. As with male itinerants or Wesley himself, there were certain households where they were always welcomed. Edward Wade's at Stourton Grange near Wetherby, or the anonymous Quaker lady in Bainbridge in Wensleydale for Mary Barrett. These women were in their travels similar to the men, but they were not following the same regime of the circuit plan. They might stay in one place and then proceed elsewhere. Though there is no evidence that Elizabeth Hurrell and Sarah Crosby were similarly invited by assistants, it seems likely that this is what had happened earlier with them. In the 1790s, Mary Barrett's correspondence shows that after a while she was so sought after that she was able to choose and to turn down, or at least put off for a period, many of the invitations. The third type were women who became local preachers rather than evangelists and went to their appointments on the plan, or their husbands' appointments, rather than taking weekday or weeknight meetings. These preachers tended to be later, that is, after 1785 or even after 1800, as Methodism settled down and more areas became covered by circuits. There were more itinerants. The circuit plan was becoming more fixed and controlling. There were more local preachers available generally, particularly in urban areas. This meant it might well seem prudent for women preachers to marry itinerants or other local preachers and to carry out a joint ministry. The picture here is of Mary, formerly Barrett, and Zechariah Taft. These women often travelled with their husbands, helping them lead worship and using their protection. It was partly adapting to the circuit preaching plan, as that became the norm, as it did in the 30 years after Wesley's death. Circuits grew and covered more of the country, but usually involved shorter distances. Examples of all this include Mary, née Woodhouse Holder, Jane Treffray, Sarah de Poutron, formerly Eland, and Margaret Hainsworth, née Hargreaves. All these four were wives of ministers, like Mary Bosanquet before them. This group of ministerial wives might move every other year to a new circuit with the men they had married. Some, such as Mary Taft, preached in their own right as much or more than local preachers, possibly even as much as the average itinerant, though in general it seems this was unlikely. Others, like Mrs. Stevens or Mrs. Wiltshire, often supplied for their husbands when they were unwell. There were also some, like Elizabeth Tomlinson here, or Sarah Mallet, who became the wives of local preachers. Both Elizabeth Evans, née Tomlinson, and her husband had their names on the Cromford preaching plan from 1819 to 1832. Their names were presumably on the Derby preaching plan before 1819, since they moved from Derby in that year. This picture is a 19th century one of Elizabeth Evans, Diana Morris, preaching on the village green. Remember, in this period, most local preachers were being asked to preach every Sunday, often several times a Sunday. Preaching wives could relieve the burden on their husbands considerably, whether ministerial or lay, and if the husband was unwell, supply for them. A slightly later example of a Wesleyan woman local preacher, who seems to have continued throughout the 19th century, including the period of so-called extinction, is Mrs. Fuller of the Swaffham Circuit. She was a local preacher in the Wesleyan Swaffham Circuit for almost 60 years, dying in 1891. It is no accident that the Swaffham Circuit was one of those where Martha Gregson and Sarah Boyce were acting as local preachers in the 20s and the 30s. That circuit was to have women local preachers for most of the century. There were many of these local preachers who acted more widely as evangelists as well. Diana Thomas is a very good example of this, a local preacher in one circuit, the large Kington circuit on the Welsh borders, but also preaching more widely, going, for example, to Aberystwyth, Machynlleth, Ledbury and Hereford. So she should be seen as a travelling evangelist as well as a local preacher. The survival of her copied diary for 1809 and 1810 shows that most Sundays she was preaching somewhere, typical of local preachers of the period. Sometimes she went with other preachers. If she was ill, they stood in for her. Yet in September 1809, she was in Neston, in the Wirral, rather a long way from her area, preaching in the week as well as on Sundays. On January the 29th, 1810, she preached 3 times during that day, and again on the Monday, 4 different sermons at 2 different places. How did early women preachers manage financially? In my research on early Methodist male preachers, it soon became apparent that one of the tests for whether a man was an itinerant preacher or not was whether he was supported by the circuits. Again and again I added a name to the list because in the surviving circuit steward's accounts his name was to be found with a payment from circuit funds. For women preachers this is not the case. No women were paid out of the connectional or circuit accounts, or at least not for preaching. Wives and daughters of male itinerants might receive payments from the connectional preachers' fund. Women preachers were not rewarded officially. So how did they survive? Some women were wealthy in their own right. They owned property and had money. This was true of Mary Bosanquet Fletcher, Mary Tooth, once Mary Fletcher had left most of her estate to her to maintain the cause in Madeley, Charlotte Berger, Henrietta Webster, Sarah Perrin and Martha Gregson. All of them might well use some of that money to support other women preachers as well as themselves. So Mary Fletcher at different times supported Sarah Ryan, Sarah Crosby, Anne Tripp, Sally Lawrence, Mary Tooth. Martha Gregson supported Sarah Boyce, who we know was poor. Mary Woodhouse, later Holder, the daughter of a Whitby master mariner, was another who seems to have inherited money. Eliza and Isabella Wilson were the sister and daughter, respectively, of Francis Wilson of Wharton Lodge near Wetherby. The Wilson family ran several farms near there. Diana Thomas ran a successful milliner's business and combined her business journeys with preaching, rather as some male itinerants had earlier combined preaching with doctoring. Mary Walsh married into money in the Gilbert family of Antigua. Mary Parker in Norfolk was wealthy enough to build 2 chapels. On the other hand, Anne Cutler and Mary Barrett started off with no financial resources and were completely dependent on their hosts. Mary Barrett's brother, John Barrett, in the first instance. In a similar position were Anne Carr and Sarah Ryan. Sarah Lawrence was an orphan. Mary Barrett might travel from one host to the next and stay 1 night, 5 nights, or several weeks. She and many other women preachers were dependent on who would provide them with food and shelter. Both Sarah Crosby and Sarah Ryan seem to have been abandoned by their husbands. Admittedly, the Tafts were better educated and had some money, so that once Mary Barrett had married Zechariah here, Zechariah's brother was a doctor, so after her marriage, Mary Taft had more resources. One argument for marrying a husband was therefore financial support as well as more access to the pulpit, especially if they'd married a husband who was a preacher and would therefore support her in both senses. Examples in this period include Sarah Mallet, Mary Barrett, Sarah Perrin. Methodist women preachers in this period were typical of the class in which most Methodist leaders were found. Small farmers, artisans, craftsmen, with some tradespeople such as Diana Thomas. A higher proportion seem to have had some money than among the male preachers. But of course we've got a much smaller sample, so it's more difficult to be certain. Both men and women preachers had a tendency to marry partners who were well off. So the wealthy wives' tendency, I noticed for the male preachers, is matched by the wealthy husbands for the women. In comparing these women preachers to the male itinerants, we see another immediate difference. The Yarm Circuit of 1768 shows a typical example of 3 male preachers travelling around a circuit of 36 societies, calling at a different one every day, and at the larger ones at the weekends. It was so regular that the preacher knew where he would be every day for the next 6 weeks, at least. Women preachers did not follow that system. Married or single. A majority of these women preachers, that is 43 out of the 66, are known to have been married at some time. However, that does not necessarily relate to the period when they were preaching. Many of them spent a long period of widowhood. Mary Fletcher here from 1785 to 1815, during which she continued to preach. If we analyse the 43, we find that at least 17 of them were preaching before they were married, and at least 10 of them preached after their husbands died, or, in the case of Sarah Crosby, was deserted by her husband. Admittedly, a few, like Mary Fletcher, preached both as a single woman and as a widow, as well as throughout her marriage, but of course her marriage was very short, only 4 years. So though it might seem that a majority had a husband during their preaching careers, in fact a majority were not usually being supported by a husband. Again, we need to admit that for several we don't know whether they were married, or if they were, whether the husband was alive at the time the wife was preaching. Some, like Charlotte Berger or Mary Tooth, are known to have decided to be single and turned down a number of suitors. Many Methodists, led by Wesley himself, supported by such as William Bramwell, argued that women preachers should not marry. Children. Of the 43 who were married, at least 16 had children. This ranged from the numerous family of Mrs. Cock, Jane Bisson, or the 11 children of Mrs. Elizabeth Collett, down to Penelope Cousins' 2 children, one of whom died young. Children certainly made it more difficult for the women preachers to preach. It has been shown that in the years that Mary Taft gave birth, she travelled to other circuits considerably less. Some of those who married did not have children, usually because they were older, like Mary Bosanquet. Travel. Some of the preachers travelled little to preach. Often for the rest, we do not know how they travelled. Many walked, just as the male local preachers usually did. Certainly Mary Barrett, in her early peregrinations, often walked, as in her memorable journey to Hexham Circuit and back in 1793-4. I travelled alone and on foot. I frequently kneeled down and was much blessed. This journey will never be obliterated from my mind. On the other hand, in 1794, in the Alnwick Circuit, she refers to her mare on which she crossed a swollen river. Riding a horse, then, as the male itinerants usually did, was therefore also an option. Diana Thomas had a white pony which carried her to her appointments over the Welsh hills. Her riding whip was actually preserved into the 20th century, though it seems to be now lost. So it's not your concern, Alison. Mary Fletcher certainly rode on a number of occasions. Mary Barrett also, in her case, usually on horses provided by friends. There were also those with money who might have some form of chaise, such as Mrs. Gregson or Miss Berger and Mrs. Webster. Mary Barrett was sometimes transported in chaises or carriages belonging to her friends, such as Edward Wade or Mr. Jackson of Harewood. She was also once transported in a farm cart, which tipped her out. Note the wagon in the painting. Travel could be a problem for women as well as for men preachers. The spirituality of the early Methodist women preachers. Max suggests that women were more eloquent about sanctification and the spiritual life than men. Quote, Methodists were in tune with women's interests in the deepest sense, because women had a profound affinity, whether cultural or inbred, with Methodist doctrines, unquote. Women have always formed the majority among Methodists. Sarah Crosby's letter book gives an interesting picture of how deep was the early Methodist women preachers' spiritual life. This extract comes from a letter of 1765. My soul shall live and die wrapped up in him. Lord, correct me when I go astray. I do not think it wrong for women to speak in public, provided they speak by the Spirit of God. I think we want more abundant life here. What a blessing it could be if the people in general were very simple and full of love. Parties in Methodism. Most women preachers set themselves against any split or threatened division within Methodism. In the 1790s, many church Methodists, that is, those who worshipped at the parish church and thought of themselves as at least as much churchmen and churchwomen as Methodists, separated themselves from Methodism as it increasingly allowed the itinerants to administer communion and so were becoming more of a church. Mary Fletcher was in many ways a church Methodist, the wife and then widow of a clergyman who continued to reside in her late husband's vicarage for 30 years until 1815. She brought all her influence to bear on Methodists in Madeley, so that most continued to worship every Sunday at St. Michael's, Madeley, as she did, while also attending her own Methodist, in quotes, services in the tithe barn beside her house. When in 1797 Alexander Killam broke with conference, eventually to set up the Methodist New Connection, Mary Barrett found the Leeds Conference, quote, a time of trial to my own mind, as I was informed of many of my own spiritual children being on the eve of leaving the Methodist body and joining Mr. Killam's party. She did her utmost to dissuade them, and indeed succeeded with the preacher Henry Taylor, who would otherwise have joined Killam. Mary Barrett also had close contacts with the revivalist Methodists. She stayed with the Broadhursts in Manchester. Her friend and mentor was, of course, William Bramwell, who invited her to all his circuits and put her portrait over his mantelpiece. I wonder whether it's this one pictured. Be fascinating to know. Bramwell had also intended to leave Methodism in 1803, together with Broadhurst and his Bandroom Methodists. He'd actually resigned from the ministry. His resignation had gone in. Again, Mary influenced Bramwell to come back, and Conference actually received him back. In general, women Methodist preachers stayed loyal in a time of division and disunion. There is a light here. Shall I continue? You can see the screen now. That's excellent. Yes, that's very good. Right. Where were we? Thank you. In general, women preachers stayed loyal. In the early 19th century, among both PMs and Bible Christians, many of their women preachers had, of course, been brought up as Wesleyans. However, in most cases, it's difficult to prove that they had preached while they had been Wesleyans. There are some exceptions. Anne Carr, Martha Williams, Hannah Woolhouse are all exceptions to that. Changes over time. During the life of John Wesley after 1761 and the 30 years after his death, there were at least 10 and usually more Methodist women preachers actively preaching in the connection at any one time. Yes, they tended to preach in private houses rather than chapels, and in small chapels rather than large ones at all periods. Not all preached in wide areas across the country. But even after the conference ban on women preaching to men in 1803, women such as Mary Fletcher, Mary Taft, and many others continued to preach. And it can be also shown that more women began to preach in every period, including after 1803. In the decade 1800 to 1809, there were at least 9 women who seem to have begun preaching. Examples include Mary Tooth, Diana Thomas, Sarah Eland. In the next decade, 1810 to 1819, another 10 seem to have begun to preach, including such as Charlotte Berger, who went on to the 1870s, and Mrs. Henrietta Webster. So the conference prohibition on women preaching in 1803, except to other women, does not seem to have altered what women preachers actually did. In 1820, at the end of this period being examined, there were at least 24 of those 66 women preachers still preaching. Preaching and texts. One of the acid tests of whether women were acting as preachers or not was, did they take texts? Exhorters famously did not. For most women preachers, we don't know enough to know whether they had texts. But it's worthwhile pointing out that we do know some of the texts. Paul Chilcott's Appendix H lists 74 occasions when sermon texts of women preachers were recorded in the period up to 1803. These were from 8 different preachers, mostly those of Mary Taft and Mary Fletcher. I've added to this number a little, mostly other preachers from another 5 preachers, all from the later period than Chilcott, who stopped in 1803, including a large number from Diana Thomas's journal. So 13 of the 66 preachers have known sermon texts. These now include such relatively unknown preachers as Rosamond Tooth, sister of the much better known Mary Tooth, but also the well-known Elizabeth Evans, origin of Diana Morris, Jane Treffry, portrait here, and Charlotte Berger, all of whom began preaching in the 19th century. If Rosamond Tooth took a text, then it seems likely that her sister Mary, who modelled herself on her mentor and patron Mary Fletcher, did as well. The same is true of most of the others in my 66. There's only one case, that of Anne Cutler, who we specifically know refused to actually take a text. However, Anne's exhortations were so powerful, she was invited to so many places. This letter, in which Wesley himself had authorized her to preach, has survived, that in her case there can be no doubt about her preaching. Where did they preach? As with the men, some, particularly those I've described as evangelists, often preached outside. For example, Mary Bosanquet in the quarry at Golka in September 76. Sarah Crosby preached to over 500, quote, in a field because no house could contain the people, unquote. Diana Thomas, rather later, preached in farmyards, marketplaces, village greens, fairs, crossroads, wayside corners. Miss Berger and Mrs. Webster once preached in a ship. Inside, they often preached in ordinary houses, but it varied enormously. Staying in an inn in Harrogate in 73, Mary Bosanquet found that the other residents insisted she spoke to them in the ballroom. They were so affected they insisted she come back the next Sunday when a larger company assembled. Inns were used quite often, as were barns, any other building where a meeting could be held. In 1797, Mary Barrett spoke to multitudes in a dye house in Leeds during the conference that year. Charlotte Berger, Henrietta Webster opened what they called preaching rooms in Walthamstow and Holloway End in 1816 and promptly preached in them. But they also had meetings in their own house. Chapels, what Wesley called preaching houses, were also frequently used. It was a period when chapels were being built, so the congregation who heard them in a house one year might well be in a chapel next year. These were mostly small ones in the country, but as larger ones were built, so women were asked to these as well. Anne Gilbert preached to 1,400 in the chapel at Redruth. Sarah Crosby in 75 preached in the large chapels in Bradford and Halifax to thousands of hearers. Charlotte Berger and Henrietta Webster were invited to preach in the chapel at Poplar in 1819. Which areas had most women preachers? Some preachers, as we've seen, stayed in one place, one area, or later one circuit. Take someone like Mary Bosanquet Fletcher. At first, her preaching life seems relatively simple. She began at Leytonstone in the 1760s, moved to Yorkshire, moved to Madeley in 1781, and remained there till her death in 1815. And then we learn she made an extensive tour of Bath, Bristol, and Kingswood from December 77 to April 78. After her marriage with her husband, she went to Dublin for several months. In all these places, she preached extensively. She returned to Bristol to preach in 1785. If we had a complete roster of everywhere she preached, I'm sure it would be wider still. However, most women preachers only preached in smaller areas. There were large areas which had no known women preaching. Scotland seems to have only had one woman preacher, quote, a female from the banks of the Spey who concluded services at Elgin around 1817, unquote. The south of England had a huge gap from Cornwall to London. Is this gap because the Tafts tended to only know preachers in the north, and therefore there's this gap in the south? Penelope Newman in Cheltenham and the villages around is someone in the South Midlands, but otherwise the South Midlands had no one apart from the minister's wife in Oxford, Mrs. Sarah Stevens. On the other hand, in the North Midlands and the North, particularly Yorkshire, women preachers abounded. At least 23 of the 66 are known to have preached in Yorkshire. Norfolk was also a seedbed for women preaching. Conclusion. In 2019, the Methodist Church in Great Britain encourages men and women to become worship leaders, local preachers, and ministers. The active presbyteral ministry is roughly half and half male and female. No figures are available for local preachers, but looking at circuit plans makes me think it is fairly equal. For worship leaders, again, no figures are known to me, but circuit plans I've looked at seem to mean more women than men are worship leaders. That equality is not there for superintendents of circuits or for chairs of districts. Both are less than a third. The church still needs to be more inclusive and to encourage more diverse talents. There are comparisons to be made with early Methodism, though obviously far fewer women than men preached then. Exhorters, which is how most early women preachers began, have some similarities to modern worship leaders. Though in Wesleyanism there were no women ministers, yet the leading women Methodist evangelists of the day, Sarah Crosby, Mary Barrett, were clearly more effective than many of the male itinerants among their contemporaries, as can be seen by the crowds who came to hear them. We should celebrate more the women pioneers of Methodism's past, especially of this little understood period. People like Mary Fletcher and Mary Barrett are little known, but should be held up as examples of people who strove against the handicaps of their society to proclaim the message of Methodism to all. Inspired by the Arminian hymns of Charles Wesley and others, which they quoted frequently, they were certain that the call to preach was for them as well. They agonized about how they should labor publicly. Mary Fletcher stood for preaching on the pulpit steps rather than go the whole way into the pulpit. When she wrote in 1803 to the Tafts, she quoted this hymn by Isaac Watts, quote, "Oh, for that strong and lasting faith, which credits all the Almighty saith, that claims the promise of the Son, and feels the Comforter its own." Mary Fletcher was claiming for Mary Taft and for herself, as representatives of all Christian women, the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, the Comforter, and the promises of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you.